One of the things that I try to establish is that you see a significant shift towards a more direct appropriation and use of Schleiermacher in his later career. And one of the ways we often think about his career is divided by his move to the Free University of Amsterdam. And so he's a briefly a pastor in the very early 1880s after his doctorate at the University of Leiden. But then he will be a professor in Kampen in the Netherlands, a smaller town, and really the school of his own denomination, all the way until 1902, the end of 1901. And as you guys know from the biography, he gets asked to come to the Free University 5 times, right? And those are very entertaining interactions between him and Kuyper in the bio that we've just had, that James has just had published. But in that early phase, what we saw was a significant amount of interaction with Schleiermacher at the University of Leiden, and really him getting deep down into reading mediation theologies, reading these modern German philosophers and theologians at that time. And he comes out of the University of Leiden, and in the first couple essays he writes, Schleiermacher's name is in the first 3 sentences. And even his dissertation opens with a paragraph on Schleiermacher and his recovery of ethics, as he begins to write an entire dissertation on the ethics of Ulrich Zwingli. And but it's bookended both at the first paragraph and very end of the work by talking about Schleiermacher's recovery of ethics, and ethics of virtue in particular in the 19th century. However, from that point in the 80s and 90s, the 1880s and 90s, we don't see him dealing with Schleiermacher in particular very often. Instead, we see a turn to the subject, if you will, emphasized in just the content of his early essays and kind of what his projects were. He wrote a big treatise, a 3-part treatise on the conscience very early on, which was a very live discussion within mediation theology being developed really in conversation with Schleiermacher and Hegel at the time. So he turns to the conscience. His stuff on the kingdom of God is just filtered with the language of how he talks about the Garden of Eden and the first sin entering the world as being the rupture of God and self-consciousness, which was exactly the way that people were often talking about it in the mediation theologies. It's the way Schleiermacher talked about it in his ethics, the rupture of God and self-consciousness in the first sin. So you have these just moments constantly in the early corpus of things like that. But then you get to the later corpus, you get to the Stone Lectures, you get to the Philosophy of Revelation. And, he says something in chapter 3 of the Philosophy of Revelation, like we have to say that Schleiermacher, more than Immanuel Kant, more than the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, got it right when they said that humanity is not autonomous, but is fundamentally categorized by a feeling of absolute dependence. And he really uses that quote, that statement, to as a thesis in some ways for his 2-chapter treatise on the self in the Philosophy of Revelation. So there is certainly, I argue, and I think at least, and there are a lot more examples, a turn to Schleiermacher in a more significant way in the latter portions of his career. We see a couple, maybe one other thing that I could mention is just, for example, in the Philosophy of Revelation. I mean, one of the reasons that Grace Sutanto and I tried to republish the Philosophy of Revelation was just because there were places in the original English translation that had not been, there were items that had not been included. So just 2 or 3 sentences here and there at times that were just not present from the Dutch edition. Funny enough, a lot of them were about Bavinck's critiques of Methodism. I'm not sure why those particular sentences didn't make the cut, but
there's a Methodist deep state, Cory. This is this is a reason.
Apparently, Gerhardus Voss had a secret.
He married a Methodist. His wife was a former Methodist. My wife is a former Methodist too, which is why I remember this. But
Wow. Well, there you go.
I don't think she's part of any intelligentsia or deep state, though. I hope not. Otherwise, I'm doomed.
Yeah, yeah. So there was a few things like that, and a few areas we thought we could translate differently. But one of the reasons was because a lot of times in a work like that, Bavinck will use German or French or something like that directly into the text in the middle of his Dutch sentences. And if you don't make a note of it, you might miss what he's doing. And so one of the things, for instance, that appears several times in the Philosophy of Revelation is he uses Schleiermacher's very unique German term for dependence. And he uses that term throughout the Philosophy of Revelation, but he doesn't translate it. He leaves it in German. And, there's only one other place that really shows up, and it's in Schleiermacher. And if you don't see the German, you wouldn't know that that's what he was doing.
Is that Gefühl? Is that the word you're referring to, or is there a different one?
Yeah, Gefühl and Gefühl, and then the modifier that Schleiermacher uses for absolute.